Hello everyone, I am Amin. Welcome to BYK Book Summary. Here we decide the mindset and story of the world's most successful icon and the most powerful books that saved them. Our mission is to bring you deep insight, your personal growth. Joining me to simplify this concept is my AI research co-host. Let's dive into today's journey of knowledge.
In 1778, the most powerful military empire on Earth was, well, essentially defeated by a man with a first-grade education.
Right, which is just wild to think about.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, this is a guy whose father literally made soap for a living. And today we're doing a deep dive into the historical blueprint of that man, Benjamin Franklin.
Because when you really look at his starting line, the math just doesn't add up.
No, not at all. We are talking about severe grinding poverty here. He's one of 17 children in this colonial household where resources are spread so incredibly thin.
Yeah, 17 kids.
Right. And his formal education just abruptly, permanently ends after only 2 years.
That's it, 2 years.
Exactly. He's handed an apron, sent into the manual workforce, and that is the official end of his schooling.
Then, this exact same person goes on to invent world-changing technology.
Yeah, and he establishes the foundational civic institutions of his entire city.
He becomes a prolific political philosopher.
Right. And then he uses his own cultivated intellect to convince a global superpower, France, to actually financially and militarily back a seemingly impossible revolution.
Which is, it's just unprecedented. The disparity between his origin and his actual output forces us to really look past the mythology. We have to examine the mechanics of his mind.
Yeah, we're not just looking at some historical curiosity today.
Exactly. We are looking at the foundational architecture of self-directed intelligence.
So our source material for this analysis relies really heavily on Franklin's own meticulous autobiography.
Yeah.
But we're taking that 18th century text and putting it through a very specific modern analytical filter.
Right. And that filter is the framework of Charlie Munger.
Yes, Charlie Munger.
Yeah.
For anyone listening who might be unfamiliar, Munger was this legendary billionaire investor and, the intellectual powerhouse right alongside Warren Buffett.
But beyond finance, Munger was really a philosopher of human cognition.
Yeah, he aggressively endorsed Franklin's autobiography. And not as a history lesson, right?
No, not at all. He viewed it as a literal operational manual. Munger believed that lifelong learning is the ultimate compounding competitive advantage in literally any era.
And he saw Franklin as the absolute patron saint of this concept.
Because Munger recognized that Franklin didn't just stumble into greatness through, pure luck.
Or like some genetic anomaly.
Exactly. He engineered his own rise through deliberate, grueling, practical methods of self-teaching. Methods that completely strip away the need for any kind of institutional validation.
So our mission here today is to dissect those exact methods.
We want to understand the mechanisms. How did he acquire knowledge? How did he structure his habits?
And how did he apply that knowledge to manipulate the world around him?
Right.
So to you listening right now, whether you're actively trying to master a complex new skill, or maybe you're feeling constrained because you don't have the quote-unquote right formal credentials.
Or if you're just drowning in modern hustle culture.
Yeah, exactly. If you're looking for a way to actually retain all the information you consume every day, this deep dive is going to provide you with a historically proven framework for outlearning absolutely anyone in the room.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the absolute necessity of Franklin hacking his own education, we cannot gloss over the reality of his childhood.
No, we have to start there.
Colonial Boston in 1706 wasn't just poor, it was, physically brutal.
Brutal is really the right word. We have to strip away that sanitized textbook image of the founding fathers in their powdered wigs.
Right, the whole glossy History Channel version.
Exactly. Franklin's father, Josiah, was a tallow chandler, which means he made soap and candles.
And in the 18th century, that was not some artisanal craft you sell at a weekend farmer's market.
No, not at all. Tallow is rendered animal fat. The daily reality for the Franklin household involved boiling massive, heavy vats of rotting animal fat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and mixing it with highly caustic lye. The stench of it would just permeate your clothes, your hair, your skin.
I can't even imagine. And the labor itself was backbreaking, right?
Absolutely backbreaking. The hours were dictated completely by daylight, and the profit margins for his dad were razor thin.
And then you add 17 children to that specific environment.
It's chaos.
Just visualizing the logistics of feeding 19 human beings under one roof on a soap maker's income is staggering.
Right. Childhood, at least in the modern sense of a protected period of exploration and play, it essentially did not exist for him.
No. He was given 2 years of what they called titular schooling, which is barely enough time to learn basic literacy and rudimentary arithmetic.
And then the money ran out.
Exactly. At 10 years old, he was pulled out of school completely.
Put to work cutting wicks and filling candle molds.
All right. And I look at this and I really have to ask, was he just a once-in-a-generation mutant genius?
Well,
Because the alternative suggests that our modern, highly structured, incredibly expensive education system might be, entirely optional.
which is a terrifying thought for anyone currently paying off massive student loans.
Right.
But Munger's analysis strongly dismisses that mutant genius theory.
Okay, so how does he explain it?
Well, while Franklin definitely possessed a high baseline intelligence, Munger points to this concept of constraint breeding resourcefulness.
Constraint breeding resourcefulness.
Right. When the traditional linear path is closed off, when that classroom door is permanently shut for you, you are left with a binary choice.
You either resign yourself to the boiling vat of animal fat.
Or you turn the external world into your university.
I love that.
The total lack of a formal curriculum forced Franklin to develop his own algorithm for acquiring knowledge. He couldn't rely on a professor to curate information for him.
He had to become a voracious, active hunter of ideas.
Exactly.
I want to challenge our modern perception of constraints based on that. Because today, we frequently use a lack of resources as a psychological safety net.
Oh, all the time.
We say things like, well, I can't learn software engineering, I don't have a computer science degree, or I can't launch this business, I don't have venture capital.
Right. We throw our hands up the second the path isn't perfectly laid out for us with a syllabus.
Yeah, we treat the lack of institutional support as a stop sign.
We use the absence of formal structure to excuse our own inertia.
Exactly.
But the source material makes it explicitly clear that Franklin viewed his lack of resources not as a barrier at all.
What did he view it as?
He viewed it as the foundational parameters of the game he was forced to play. He had no money, no pedigree, and literally zero academic credentials.
Well, his mind was the only point of leverage he possessed.
Right. It was the only tool he had to pry himself out of that tallow shop. He realized very early on that if he wanted a different physical reality, he had to build a radically different mental architecture than the men standing next to him at the vats.
The urgency of that realization must have been overwhelming for a kid. I mean, he knows he has to pull this mental lever. But how does a kid with a first-grade education actually gain access to the knowledge economy of the 1700s?
Well, the answer is both brilliant and, honestly, a little bit ruthless.
He bypasses the gatekeepers entirely.
Exactly. At 12 years old, because there's just no money for further schooling, his father formally apprentices him to his older brother, James.
And James runs a printing press.
Right. But we need to really define what an apprenticeship meant at that time.
Yeah, it was not a summer internship.
No, it was an indenture. It was a legally binding contract where your labor, your time, and essentially your bodily autonomy belonged to your master.
Who in this case was his own brother.
Right. And this contract was for up to 7 years. You were unpaid, you couldn't marry without permission, and you absolutely couldn't leave.
But the printing press itself was a critical variable here, because in colonial America, the printing house was the absolute epicenter of information flow.
Yes. He's placed right in the middle of the intellectual superhighway of Boston.
Even though he's doing all the physical grunt work, right? Like
Yeah.
hauling heavy lead type, operating the mechanical press.
Yeah. But he's surrounded by words. He's setting the type for newspapers, political pamphlets, books. He is literally touching the ideas of the era, letter by letter.
Wow. But passive absorption wasn't enough for him.
No, he wanted to actively participate in the discourse.
But the problem is, nobody's going to publish the political or social opinions of a 12-year-old indentured servant.
Right. The societal hierarchy back then was rigid. An apprentice had absolutely no voice.
So Franklin invents a voice.
Yes. And this brings us to one of the most psychologically fascinating episodes of his early life. He starts writing essays and secretly slipping them under the door of his brother's printing house at night.
But he doesn't write them from the perspective of an ambitious teenage boy.
No, he creates a pen name, Silence do good.
Silence do good.
And he constructs an entire elaborate persona around her. Silence do-good is this middle-aged, highly opinionated, slightly cynical widow who lives out in the country.
And she has these incredibly sharp critiques on the hypocrisy of Boston society, the state of education, the treatment of women.
Right. Think about the sheer cognitive empathy required to pull that off.
It's insane. A boy, barely hitting puberty, possesses the observational bandwidth to perfectly mimic the syntax, the world weariness, and the specific concerns of an adult woman.
And he writes 14 of these essays.
And they don't just get published, they become a massive sensation.
The readers of his brother's newspaper are completely fooled.
They engage with her, they debate her points.
Mm-hmm.
I read that some men even wrote in offering to marry her.
Yeah. He essentially created an 18th century viral burner account to circumvent the industry gatekeepers.
That is just so funny to me.
Yeah.
But it's also brilliant.
The silence do-good experiment is really our first clear evidence of his capacity for active observation.
Right, because he wasn't just reading books, he was reading people.
Exactly. He was studying the cadence of how adults spoke, what they complained about, what arguments persuaded them. He was treating human behavior as a subject to be formally mastered.
But this massive intellectual triumph ended up creating a huge interpersonal disaster.
It really did. Because when his brother James inevitably discovered that his star columnist was actually his own subordinate younger brother, the dynamic turned incredibly toxic.
Right. The mentorship just devolved into jealousy and resentment.
And according to Franklin's own accounts, physical beatings.
Yeah, so the tension reaches a boiling point. And by the time Franklin is 17, he realizes that staying in Boston under his brother's thumb means a permanent ceiling on his potential.
Right.
So he makes a decision that is honestly incredibly difficult for a modern listener to fully contextualize. He runs away.
He breaks his indenture contract.
He sneaks onto a ship and flees to Philadelphia.
And we have to remember, breaking an indenture in the 1720s was a severe criminal offense.
He wasn't just moving to a new city to, find himself.
No, he was a fugitive. If caught, he could be imprisoned or forcibly returned to his brother.
So he arrives in Philadelphia exhausted, soaking wet from the journey, with literally 3 pennies in his pocket.
3 pennies. He has no family there, no friends, no letters of introduction.
And the constant threat of the law hanging over him.
Right. He traded every single shred of physical and legal security he had for absolute autonomy.
I really want to linger on that moment for a second. Because a 17-year-old kid standing on the docks of a strange city, gnawing on a dry roll of bread with zero safety net. It exposes a universal, often terrifying truth about high achievers. Sometimes, optimizing your potential requires completely severing ties with a limiting environment.
Even if that environment is your own family.
Exactly. Or your hometown, or a secure, predictable career path.
He bet his literal life on the belief that his mind, which he had been secretly sharpening this whole time, was valuable enough to keep him from starving.
It was an incredibly asymmetric risk. The downside was prison or starvation. The upside was freedom.
Yeah.
But as Charlie Munger would point out here, Franklin was operating with a very specific mental model. He knew he possessed intrinsic capital.
The printing press hadn't just taught him to pull a heavy lever. Right. It had taught him the mechanics of communication, media, and rhetoric. So he arrived broke, but he was highly skilled.
His mind was primed for the next phase of his self-education.
Exactly, which is where his methodology truly aligns with modern theories of high performance.
And this is the perfect pivot to Munger's philosophy. Munger famously described himself as a book-reading machine with 2 legs.
I love that quote.
Right. He argued that continuous compounding reading is the absolute, non-negotiable baseline for success in any field.
And he viewed Franklin as the historical gold standard for this exact behavior.
So when Franklin gets established in Philadelphia and starts earning just a meager wage in another printing shop, how does he actually deploy his resources?
He directs every spare cent toward acquiring information.
Every single cent.
Yeah. The autobiography details links that honestly border on obsession. At one point, to save money to buy more books, he adopts a strict vegetarian diet.
Wait, really? A vegetarian diet in the 1720s?
Yes, because he realizes that meat is expensive, but boiled potatoes and rice are cheap.
That is wild.
And furthermore, while all his fellow apprentices are taking these long lunches to eat heavy meat and drink ale, returning to work sluggish.
Let me guess, Franklin doesn't do that.
Right. Franklin eats a biscuit, drinks some water, and uses the saved time and mental clarity to read.
Whoa.
He is actively optimizing his physiology to maximize his reading time.
He's literally biohacking in the 1720s so he can afford more books.
Exactly.
And he's reading while the rest of the city is sleeping. The sources show he taught himself Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish.
All on his own.
But I have a major point of contention here.
Okay, let's hear it.
I hear people talk about reading all the time today. Everyone claims to be a voracious reader. But if I read a really dense book on economics, and I highlight a bunch of paragraphs with a yellow marker, and then I put it back on the shelf, isn't that what Franklin was doing?
Not at all.
I mean, isn't deliberate practice just a fancy modern buzzword for studying really hard?
The distinction between what you just described, the highlighting, and what Franklin was actually doing, is the difference between floating in a river and swimming against the current.
Okay, unpack that.
Highlighting text is passive consumption. It feels like work, right? But cognitive psychologists will tell you it creates an illusion of competence.
An illusion of competence.
Yeah. You recognize the words on the page as you read them, so you trick yourself into believing you actually understand the underlying concept.
Right, because it looks familiar.
Exactly. But deliberate practice requires cognitive friction. It requires you to attempt to produce the knowledge yourself, fail at it, identify the specific gap in your understanding, and try again.
So how did Franklin actually generate that cognitive friction? Because, he didn't have a professor grading his essays and telling him where his arguments were weak.
He engineered his own feedback loop, and he did this most famously through his method for mastering writing.
Oh, the spectator method.
Yes. Franklin realized early on that his writing was decent, but it lacked elegance and persuasive power. He wanted to write like the authors of The Spectator,
which was this highly regarded British publication known for its pristine prose.
Right. So instead of just reading The Spectator and highlighting the good parts, he developed a systematic reverse engineering process.
How did it work?
He would take a published article, read it thoroughly, and then write down short cryptic notes, just hints of the sentiment of each sentence.
So he's essentially extracting the skeleton of the argument.
Precisely. Then he would hide the magazine. He would wait several days until the exact wording had faded from his short-term memory.
That's the key part, waiting for it to fade.
Right. Then he would take his cryptic notes and attempt to reconstruct the entire article from scratch.
Wow.
He was trying to match the eloquence, the vocabulary, and the structural flow of the original author.
Let me stop you there, because the analogy that jumps to my mind immediately is training a machine learning model.
Oh, that's interesting.
Think about how we train AI today. We feed the model a massive data set, which in Franklin's case is reading tons of books.
Right.
Then we give the model a prompt, which are his cryptic notes.
Okay, yeah.
The model generates an output, which is his rewritten article.
Yeah.
And then comes the most important part of machine learning, calculating the loss function or the error rate.
That is an incredibly accurate parallel. The final step of Franklin's method was literally the human equivalent of calculating that loss function.
So what did he do?
He would take his newly drafted article, place it side by side with the original published piece, and rigorously compare them.
Line by line.
Exactly. He would identify exactly where his vocabulary was repetitive, where his transitions were clunky, or where his logic just failed to land with the same punch.
And then what?
He would mark his errors, correct his text, and then do it all again with another article, over and over and over.
That sounds absolutely agonizing.
It is.
It's no wonder people prefer just highlighting things. He was deliberately confronting his own inadequacy every single day.
Which is why it worked.
But this brings up a really fascinating paradox. Because today, we have the entirety of human knowledge sitting in our pockets.
Literally.
I can download a free PDF of The Spectator right now. I can watch free lectures from MIT on quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
Information has never been cheaper or more abundant.
Never.
Yet, collectively, we seem to struggle immensely with focus and retention.
Right.
We scroll, we skim, we consume 10 podcasts a week, but we don't retain any of it. Did the extreme scarcity of books in colonial America force a depth of engagement that our modern abundance actually destroys?
I think scarcity demands utility. When a single book costs a week's wages, and you only have one tallow candle to read it by before you have to go to sleep, you do not skim.
No, you extract every solitary drop of value from those pages.
Munger talks about this constantly. He notes that Franklin treated every encounter with information and every subsequent failure to recreate it perfectly as pure data.
Pure.
Yeah. When Franklin's vocabulary fell short during that spectator exercise, he didn't view it as a personal emotional defeat. He didn't say, oh, I'm just a bad writer.
He viewed it as a data point.
Exactly. My lexicon regarding political philosophy is insufficient. I must adjust my inputs. He systemized his intellectual growth.
So the modern challenge isn't finding information.
No, it's resisting the urge to be merely entertained by it. If you aren't testing your recall, failing in a controlled environment, and adjusting your mental models, you aren't learning. You're just watching a performance.
Entertained by information. Oof, that cuts deep.
It's the truth for a lot of us.
We really do mistake the feeling of consuming information for the actual act of building a skill.
Yes, we do.
But let's push this framework into a completely different domain now. Because mastering external skills like writing, languages, and eventually science, that's one thing. You can track that.
Right. You either built the lightning rod correctly or the building burns down.
Exactly. But how do you apply this rigorous algorithmic thinking to your internal life?
Now that is the real challenge.
Because a runaway teenager
Yeah.
with a really sharp pen and a massive intellect is a prime recipe for profound arrogance.
Definitely.
How did he prevent his own ego and impulses from sabotaging his rise?
Well, he realized early on that cognitive intelligence without behavioral control is a huge liability.
Okay.
He needed a structural framework to govern his character, not just his intellect. And this leads to his most ambitious and, frankly, most audacious project. His attempt to arrive at moral perfection.
Moral perfection. He literally wanted to live without committing any fault at any time.
Yes.
Which is deeply hilarious and incredibly hubristic.
Oh, absolutely. Even he eventually admitted it was an impossible standard.
But the system he created to attempt it is legendary. He didn't just say, I want to be a good person.
Right, because that's too vague.
He broke being a good person down into manageable, trackable metrics. He identified 13 specific virtues that he believed were essential for a functional, successful life.
Let's list those out because they are fascinating.
Yeah, from the autobiography, those were temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility.
It's such a perfect reflection of Enlightenment-era values.
Right.
But the brilliance isn't really in the list itself, it's in the methodology of execution.
How he tracked them.
Right. He understood that vague aspirations fail. So he engineered a highly specific quantitative tracking system. He created a physical book.
Okay.
Inside, he drew a grid. He had the 7 days of the week across the top and the 13 virtues down the side.
He literally invented the modern habit tracker on a piece of parchment.
He really did.
Hundreds of years before Silicon Valley tech executives were evangelizing about OKR's objectives and key results, Franklin was running a daily behavioral audit.
Yes. But the real cognitive genius of his system is how he structured the focus.
Right, because he didn't try to tackle all 13 virtues simultaneously.
No, he knew that the cognitive load of a total personality overhaul would lead to immediate failure and burnout.
The human brain rebels against massive sudden change.
Exactly. By dedicating a full week to exclusively monitoring just one virtue, let's say temperance, which meant eating and drinking moderately.
Okay.
He allowed his neural pathways to form the initial grooves of that habit without the distraction of trying to be perfectly frugal and perfectly silent at the exact same time.
So during his week of temperance, if he failed, what did he do?
He would mark a little black dot on the grid for that day.
So the goal was a clean row, 7 days without a black mark.
Right.
And while he was hyper-focused on temperance, if he was a little bit disorganized that week or if he talked too much, he didn't beat himself up.
No, the laser focus was strictly on one single behavioral metric.
Then the next week, he would shift his intense focus to the second virtue, silence.
Hoping that the habit of temperance from the week prior would just carry over naturally on autopilot?
He was relying on compounding behavioral change.
Absolutely, and he documented his failures meticulously. There's a famous anecdote in his autobiography regarding the virtue of order, the idea that everything should have its place and every part of his business should have its time.
I love this story. He struggled with order immensely. Right?
Oh, he was terrible at it. His printing shop was chaotic. His papers were everywhere.
Yeah.
So he tells the story of a man buying an axe from a blacksmith.
Okay.
The man wants the entire surface of the axe to be as bright and shiny as the edge. The blacksmith says, fine, turn the grindstone. So the man turns and turns, just exhausting himself, while the blacksmith presses the flat of the axe against the stone.
It's so much work.
Right. Finally, the man stops, totally exhausted, and says, I'll just take it speckled.
The speckled axe.
Yeah.
It's such a profound realization for him. He realizes that demanding absolute perfection of himself, a perfectly shiny axe, was making him miserable.
And worse, it would make him insufferable to be around.
Yeah, a perfectly flawless person is intimidating and alienating to others.
He accepted that a few flaws, a few speckles, were necessary to function in a society of imperfect humans. It highlights the immense cognitive load of perfectionism.
It really does. But it also frames a crucial debate when we look at modern productivity culture today.
How so?
Well, today, our OKRs and our habit tracking apps are almost exclusively geared toward external output. We track lagging indicators.
Like what?
We track how many steps we took, how many sales calls we made, how many words we wrote, how much revenue we generated. We are hyper-optimizing our machines, our bodies, and our schedules to produce more stuff.
Exactly. We optimize for output, but Franklin was optimizing for input. He was tracking his character.
Let's look closely at a couple of these virtues through a modern lens. Take silence. Franklin defined it as, speak not, but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversation.
Imagine the psychological impact of systematically tracking your ability to shut up and actively listen for an entire week in a modern corporate office.
Or in social media.
Right. The modern equivalent of silence wouldn't just be about not speaking, it would be about aggressive listening and observing.
It ties right back to his success as silence do-good. You cannot accurately model the world or empathize with others if you're constantly broadcasting your own internal monologue.
Exactly. And if we look at industry, his definition was, lose no time, be always employed in something useful, cut off all unnecessary actions.
Oh, that one hurts.
Doesn't it? Tracking industry for a week in an era of infinite scrolling, TikTok, and digital pacification would be a brutal audit.
Tracking the actual minutes spent on a genuinely useful endeavor versus the hours lost to digital distraction.
It radically shifts the paradigm of what makes a good day. Because today, we evaluate our days by asking, did I empty my inbox? Or did I hit my step count?
But Franklin evaluated his day by asking, was I sincere today? Was I just in my dealings? Was I tranquil in the face of inevitable stress?
He understood that external success, wealth, status, output is incredibly fragile if the internal foundation is rotten. And by building that internal foundation first, virtue by virtue, he created a psychological operating system capable of supporting an almost incomprehensible level of external output later in life.
Which demands we look at the actual return on investment of these methods.
Right. What actually happens when a human being applies deliberate practice and systematic virtue tracking relentlessly over the course of decades?
Let's look at the scoreboard. Because reading by candlelight and tracking your temperance on a piece of parchment sounds very noble, but Franklin wasn't a monk meditating on a mountain.
No, he was deeply entrenched in the material world.
And the output of this self-taught soapmaker's son is genuinely staggering. We all know the basic trivia of the kite and the lightning experiment, sure, but when you stack his full resume up, it just defies categorization.
The sheer breadth of his contributions is what's truly astonishing. I mean, he invented bifocal glasses.
Just because he was tired of switching between two pairs of glasses.
Right. He invented the lightning rod, fundamentally altering our relationship with weather and saving countless structures from destruction.
He organized the entire American postal system, optimizing logistics across vast colonial distances.
He was the primary driver behind establishing Philadelphia's first public library.
And its first organized fire department.
And its first hospital.
Optics, meteorology, national logistics, civil engineering, public health care.
He wasn't just dabbling in these fields, he was creating foundational infrastructure from scratch.
In today's world, the prevailing advice is to stay in your lane.
Right. Find a niche.
Exactly. We are told to find a niche, hyper-specialize, get a PhD in one incredibly narrow sliver of evolutionary biology or macroeconomics, and stay there for your entire career.
But Franklin is the ultimate, undeniable counter-argument to the modern cult of hyper-specialization.
And this brings us right back to Charlie Munger. Munger is a staunch advocate for what he calls worldly wisdom.
Yes. Munger argues that you cannot make accurate decisions if you only view the world through a single academic lens.
He champions the idea of building a latticework of mental models drawn from various disciplines: math, biology, psychology, history.
And Franklin was the absolute embodiment of this latticework. He was a polymath, not in spite of his lack of formal education, but perhaps because of it.
Because he never had a professor tell him, "You're an engineering major, stop reading philosophy."
Right.
He just followed his curiosity wherever the friction of a problem led him. If a civic issue required an understanding of fluid dynamics, he taught himself fluid dynamics.
If it required understanding behavioral incentives to get people to actually fund a fire department, he applied the psychology he'd been studying since his Silence Do Good days.
He saw the entire board, not just a single square.
Exactly. But you know, the absolute pinnacle of this worldly wisdom, the achievement that arguably altered the trajectory of human history more than any of his scientific discoveries, was his role in international diplomacy.
Okay, let's get into this. Because during the American Revolution, the colonies are in a desperate existential crisis.
They're drastically underfunded, practically starving, outgunned, and facing the greatest military and naval empire on the planet.
Great Britain.
Right. They absolutely require an ally to survive. They need the wealth and the navy of France.
And who does the fledgling American Congress send to Paris to secure this totally impossible alliance?
They don't send a career diplomat with an aristocratic pedigree and decades of protocol training.
No, they send Benjamin Franklin, a man with no noble blood, a man who taught himself French by struggling through books late at night in a printing shop.
And yet, he walks into the French court at Versailles, the absolute global epicenter of elite powdered wig sophistication, and he completely manipulates them.
How does he actually do it?
He does it by executing a masterclass in applied psychology. Franklin understood the intellectual current of France at the time.
What were they obsessed with?
The French Enlightenment was obsessed with the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his concept of the natural man.
Which was the idea that humanity in its rustic, uncorrupted state was somehow morally superior to the decadence of European nobility.
Exactly. Franklin knew this, so when he arrived in Paris, he didn't try to outdress the French courtiers. He didn't wear a powdered wig or fancy silk suits.
He weaponized his lack of aristocratic background.
Yes!
He wore a plain brown suit. He wore a rustic marten fur cap.
He played the exact character they desperately wanted him to be. The wise, uncorrupted, rustic philosopher from the American wilderness.
It was a strategic performance, honed from the very same empathetic observation skills he used to create Silence Do Good when he was 12.
He charmed the French salons not with intimidation, but with wit, conversation, and a really deep understanding of human nature.
He utilized the ultimate culmination of his lifelong learning, because diplomacy is, at its core, applied psychology, history, and communication.
Every single hour he spent reverse engineering The Spectator, every failure he analyzed on his 13 virtues chart, every scientific principle he debated, had prepared him for those conversations in Paris.
Think about it. Without Franklin's self-education, he doesn't have the intellectual agility to charm the French elite.
And without his charm, the French alliance likely doesn't happen.
And without the French military and financial backing, the American Revolution almost certainly collapses.
It is the ultimate historical proof that curiosity, deliberate reading, and rigorous character development can quite literally reshape the geopolitical world.
Without a single formal degree to validate it.
It really forces us to view lifelong learning not as a hobby, but as a lever capable of moving the world.
We've covered a massive expanse of history today, tracing the arc from a brutal soapmaker shop in colonial Boston to the opulent halls of Versailles, all guided by the internal architecture of one man's mind.
Yeah, so it's time to distill the specific, non-negotiable takeaways from Franklin's autobiography and Munger's philosophy for you to apply right now.
Right. If we synthesize this deep dive, 3 distinct pillars emerge. The first is an immediate, necessary mindset shift. A lack of resources is an illusion in the modern era.
A total illusion.
If Benjamin Franklin could master 4 languages and the nuances of political rhetoric, using a fiercely protected, meager book budget in the 1700s, then our modern excuses regarding a lack of access hold 0 weight.
You must leverage our modern equivalents, the free PDFs, the dense podcasts, the high-level university lectures available online, with the exact same intensity and desperation that Franklin applied to physical books.
The second pillar requires you to ruthlessly evaluate how you are interacting with that information. You must abandon passive consumption and embrace deliberate practice.
Stop merely highlighting text and nodding along to podcasts. Emulate the spectator method.
Force yourself into the uncomfortable, frustrating zone of testing your recall. Write out the concepts in your own words, find the gaps in your understanding, and adjust your mental models.
If you are not experiencing cognitive friction, you are not learning.
And the third pillar is internal. It is the realization that your character, your integrity, and your behavioral responses can be engineered just as systematically as a technical skill like coding or writing.
Build a personal virtue system. Track your internal character, not just your external output.
Which brings us to the actionable template we promised. How do you build your own 21st century version of Franklin's Grid this week?
Step 1. Identify your own core values. Do not simply copy Franklin's 18th century list. Determine what virtues are foundational to your specific goals today.
Perhaps your 5 virtues are deep work, active listening, frugality, digital minimalism, and patience.
Okay, then step 2. Create the grid. Days of the week on the top, your chosen virtues down the side.
Step 3 is the real secret to making it work. Ruthlessly limit your focus. Do not try to be perfect at all 5 simultaneously. Choose one specific habit this week.
If your focus is active listening, your only goal is to end each day without putting a black mark in that row.
If you catch yourself interrupting a colleague to prove how smart you are, that's a mark.
If you tune out your partner while looking at your phone, that's a mark.
For the other 4 virtues, just let them exist at their normal baseline. Do not stress over them. Hyper-focus on the one.
Then next week, rotate your intense focus to deep work. The following week, frugality. It is a simple, entirely free algorithm for behavioral change.
If you treat your failures not as emotional indictments of your worth, but as objective data points indicating where the system needs adjustment, the compounding effects over months and years will be transformative.
Franklin lived to be 84 years old, and he was actively contributing to society, writing, inventing, and engaging in deep discourse until his final days.
His learning never stopped. The cognitive engine he built as an indentured servant in that printing press ran flawlessly for 7 decades.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought regarding your own trajectory. Consider where you are right now.
If your formal education permanently ended today, if no one ever handed you another syllabus, if no manager ever mandated another training seminar, if no institution ever offered you another credential,
how much further could pure, relentless curiosity, deliberate practice, and self-directed reading take you over the next 50 years?
that is the question to wrestle with. Think back to that young boy suffocating in the smell of boiling tallow, surrounded by 16 siblings, with the door to the schoolhouse locked tight behind him.
Where we see an ending, he saw the parameters of a new game.
The tools to play that game are all around you, infinitely more abundant now than at any point in human history. The only variable left to resolve is your willingness to turn the grindstone. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep tracking your character, keep reading, and keep learning.
So, friends, those were the powerful insight that can truly transform your life. Remember, growth doesn't come from the just listening, but from applying this lesson. If you want to get 1% better every day, make sure to subscribe and follow BYK Book Summary. I am Amin, and I will see you in the next episode with another incredible story. Until then, read more, think deeper, and live with meaning.